Hey everyone, Dwarlock here, and today I wanted to take a look at the show that has taken the anime world by storm. Spy X Family, or Spy Family, or Spy Types, you get the point. But for what seems like a pretty goofy action comedy anime, there are actually some really cool themes and philosophy that I want to take a look at in the show, specifically in terms of how we perceive reality and truth. But before we get started, I wanted to give a quick spoiler warning for those who haven't seen the show yet. We'll be covering some moments and scenes that appear throughout the anime, so tune out now if you don't want any spoilers. You have been warned. And now that this is out of the way, let's get back to the video. So, what about the show is so deep and philosophical? Well, the answer to that revolves around the idea of how we perceive reality. Specifically, do we perceive reality objectively or subjectively? Soren Kierkegaard famously said that subjectivity is truth, and Spy X Family seemingly agrees with this statement. I mean, the whole show revolves around this idea that Kierkegaard presents. I mean, just look at the premise the show follows, with the characters we watch forming this pretend family with a heavy emphasis on the word pretend. But yet, for the world and even for themselves, this line between pretend and real seems to blur. And this falls entirely in line with the idea that Kierkegaard presents. When Kierkegaard made the statement that subjectivity is truth, he wasn't saying that there is no truly objective reality, but rather that truth is not only just a matter of discovering objective facts. Instead, there's a second and more crucial element of truth, which involves how one relates themselves to these objective facts. For these objective truths to have an impact on us, we have to recognize them as a truth. We have to believe them to be true. And so how does this relate back to the idea of the pretend family and Spy X Family? Well, you see, if the people around them perceive them to be a family, if they come to their own conclusion that they are a family, then for them, that is more impactful than the objective truth that the forgers are, well, a pretend family. And the same goes for the daughter Anya, who ultimately knows that the family is fake. Despite knowing that the family is make-believe for the purposes of convenience, Anya still adores her pretend parents, and she treats them as if they were her real parents. And this ultimately mirrors the idea that Kierkegaard presents, and that more so than what is actually true, what is more important for us is what we believe to be true. And so, going back to the premise of the show, the question is this family real or not? Well, for Anya and for many of the characters who believe it to be real, it doesn't matter that the objective truth is that the fact that the family is pretend and created for the sake of convenience. What matters for them is that this family is real to them. And thus, Spy X Family presents an idea similar to Kierkegaard's own conclusions, that ultimately I must find a truth that is true for me. But the philosophy tie-ins of Spy X Family don't just stop there. Spy X Family poses another interesting question. Can we perceive reality for what it is? Do we perceive the same realities differently? Spy X Family, interestingly enough, expands on this question of perceiving reality through introducing different lenses of perception that we, the viewer, can see through. You see, in the show, amongst all the normal people, with their normal abilities to interpret the world, people like you and me, there's one character in particular that stands out, and that is, well, Anya. Unlike characters like Lloyd and Yor, who themselves cannot perceive more than what meets the eye, Anya is different in that she can perceive more than a normal being. She can see into one's mind. And this entirely transcendent perception of the world is reminiscent of the idea of a subjective character of experience, a term coined by the philosopher Thomas Nagel in his paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? In this paper, Thomas Nagel presents a unique argument about the perception of reality as it relates to the topic of consciousness. Using the example of a bat, Thomas Nagel presents the argument that even though bats share the same reality as us, they have their own way of perceiving the world that is different because they possess sonar. He states that bats' sonar, though clearly a form of perception, is not similar in its operation to any sense that we possess, and there's no reason to suppose that it is subjectively like anything we can experience or imagine. And as a result of this, Nagel states that it would be impossible to understand the reality that the bat itself perceives, to the extent that I could look and behave like a bat. Without changing my fundamental structure, my experiences would not be anything like the experiences of that animal. In this, Nagel presents a case that because a bat perceives the world in a way that's vastly different than me and you, that reality for that bat is understood vastly differently than reality for a human. But Nagel takes this example even further, comparing it to the hypothetical of what it would be like to be an alien, stating that a Martian scientist with no understanding of visual perception could understand the rainbow or lightning or clouds as physical phenomena. though he would never be able to understand the human concepts of rainbow, lightning, or cloud, or the place these things occupy in our phenomenal world. In this hypothetical, Nagel presents an argument that we can never understand the bat or the alien's reality. We can imagine, we can never exactly understand what it's like to experience something from a lens that isn't our own. As such, our interpretation of reality differs as a result. And so that was a lot to take in. And so the question begs, how does that really relate back to Spy X Family? Well, in short, one of the arguments Nagel would be presenting in Spy X Family is that Anya and Lloyd/Yor could see the same events, but they would understand them entirely differently, and that's because Anya's ability to read minds effectively functions as another sense for her beyond the basic five senses, and this is heavily shown throughout the anime. Like, do you remember episode 2, right? It's when Lloyd is first introduced to Yor, and it's when they each see each other committing what we could call peculiar acts. Yor sees Lloyd beating up men in a car pursuit, which he explains away as being that, he's a psychiatrist treating his patients with concussive therapy. And then Lloyd sees Yor's super strength and combat abilities, which he explains away as being good at self defense. And so for each of these two, they accept their cover stories to be as such, because, there isn't enough evidence for them to perceive any better, right? But, however, if Anya was in the scene, her understanding of why Lloyd and Yor act the way they do would be drastically different, due to our extrasensory ability to read minds. It lets her physically perceive that, Lloyd is doing these actions as a spy, and that Yor is doing these actions as an assassin. For Anya, super strength isn't the result of Yor being an office worker who's good at self-defense. Rather, she knows it's because Yor is, a super strong assassin. And the same goes for Lloyd. She knows that Lloyd sometimes going into random combat with people isn't because he's a psychiatrist or even a professional tag player, but rather because he's a spy that needs to do it for his missions. And thus, like how a Martian would understand the concepts and the significance of a rainbow differently than us, Anya understands reality differently than Lloyd and Yor. She understands the significance and motivations behind their actions differently than the rest of the world because she can perceive it differently. And so yeah, what can we really conclude from all of this? Well, for one, Spy X Family has this really cool perspective on the philosophical discussion of objective versus subjective reality. And whether or not it's intentional or not, who knows? But regardless, I think it's really cool the way that Spy X Family presents its premise, in that it gives us this pretend family that we follow and that we see others look into their lives, and while giving us a character that can see through any lies. I think that's just such a super interesting, such a fun perspective and take on a show. But regardless, am I looking too deep into what is probably just a fun action comedy? Yeah, probably. Yeah, it still is funny to look at and possibly overanalyze the themes and ideas behind what makes this show such a banger. And I can't wait to see more of what lies ahead. But until next time, Dwarlock signing off.